He signed the papers with the same precise calm with which he ran his company. A single black-inked stroke that closed more than a contract. Zantha Wayne stared at the pen as if it might reopen the decision. Around them the room hummed with polite satisfaction, her adoptive mother's breathy relief, an uncle's approving laughter, a legal advisor ticking boxes on a tablet. Crispen Sharp's face was a study in neutral steel, the kind of face that gave nothing away. He slid the pen back across the table, and when his hand brushed the leather folder already stamped with Sharp and Yale, his fingers were cool enough that the heat in Xantha's palm seemed absurd. Outside, rain made the city glass run like a confession. Inside, the arrangement had a neat commercial ring to it. Alliances secured, reputations preserved, an old wound nursed into a treaty. Zantha had not wanted this life. She had wanted her work, briefs, courtrooms, arguments that landed on law like a stone on a pond, and a small uncluttered apartment where her sensitive stomach could be appeased by predictable food. Instead, she had signed because sometimes survival looked like compromise. Because her adoptive family presumed their ties to the Yales could right the lineage wrongs whispered about when she was a child. Because the alternative, open war in public, would splinter the fragile normal she had known. He stood when she did, as if to let custom and correctness make up for the lack of tenderness. He offered his arm in the way a gentleman offered a stepping stone across a puddle, and Zantha took it because it was simpler than arguing and because relief has its own vocabulary. One accepts a sensible hand when the alternative is to wobble on your own. They moved past the crowd. Somewhere beyond the foyer, a valet held a tray of steaming food. Crispen watched Zantha for the breath of a second, long enough for her to notice his eyes at all, and then his attention returned to a message on his phone. She remembered later, with a detail small enough to embarrass her when she told it to a friend, how he had fished from a paper bag for 2 soup dumplings and thrust one toward her with an awkward stipulation of propriety. "Eat. You look like you might faint," he said. His voice had been low, the words were not gentle, but the warmth of the dumpling fogged the rain on the car window, and for a confused second, only a second, she felt seen. That tiny, inadequate kindness lodged itself in her like a splinter, an irritant that refused to be ignored the longer she carried it. The marriage was arranged. The first weeks were a study in boundaries and treaties. Their villa, a tasteful house smoothed of everything personal, came with 2 master bedrooms and a shared calendar pinned to a fridge the housekeeper kept immaculate. Crispen's private life was as exact as his meetings. Breakfasts at 8, conference calls at 9, dinners at 7 when necessary. He signed invoices with the same expression he had used at the ceremony. Flat, precise, unreadable. Zantha returned to work the way a diver returns to the depths. Deliberate breath, steadying the stomach, checking the safety line. At the firm she moved like someone who knew how to hold a room with facts and a sentence that would not wag. Negotiations, depositions, witness interviews, this was the part of life she could control. Her reputation as a rising lawyer was not a rumor. It was made of late nights, meticulous citations, and the way judges began to lean in when she folded an argument around the truth. When Mr. Hart called her into his office to talk, she felt the ease of professional companionship. He had been her mentor since her 2nd year, blunt, world-weary, the kind of man who kept a tin of cheap candy on his desk and expected her to eat the wrappers with the case notes. He liked her for being incorruptible. She liked him for keeping the law small enough to be lovable. He was the kind of person one imagined boring into a long retirement with a pipe and a dog on his porch. The crash, sudden, ridiculous, a commuter bus and a distracted driver and a smear of headline panic, was an interruption not meant for her to control. His hospital bed smelled of antiseptic and fruit juice, and the firm shifted, partners whispered, clients grew anxious, and a case that had been Mr. Hart's responsibility slid onto Xantha's desk like an awkward inheritance. Everything that could be filed onto her shoulders was filed. A trial on procedural grounds became hers. A defensive settlement that had to be unwound because new evidence had crawled up from a neglected folder found her staring at pages at 3 in the morning, the city outside blinking at the wrongness of it. She was good at this. She had always been good at taking what life handed and making it precise. Crispen, when he noticed the midnight lights in the study upstairs, left her a thermos of broth the next day with a post-it that read, simply, for later. He did not leave the note where a lover might leave a confession. He left it on the stack of legal pads she kept, as if to remind her that practical things were not trivial. Publicly, he remained the owner of a face that did not betray. He accepted introductions with the professional politeness of someone who was used to being recommended like a business unit. There was a room full of people who needed him to be unflappable, and he complied. Privately, his care had the patience of a ledger balanced in margins, precise actions, recorded and kept. He arranged for a specialist to review her dietary concerns and had a discreet delivery of porridge sent to the villa when she was ill. He learned, in his quiet ways, which medicines she could tolerate and the brands she avoided, the way a man in command learns the details of his operations. The revelations were not accompanied by "I love you." They came with no theatrical flourish. He showed up where it mattered. Zantha's identity at the firm became a shield and a weapon. When whispers of her past, of switched birth and questions about paternity crept out at family dinners, she had the luxury of method, evidence, precedent, a pointed question that silenced small-town familiarity. At home, the wounds bled more slowly. Her adoptive sister, Zaniah Yale, moved through the family like a sharp-edged rumor. Zaniah's jealousy was a living thing. It smelled of perfumed anger, and a need that had been translated into spite. Zaniah smiled with the kind of public sweetness that left private teeth behind, compliments that sounded like knives wrapped in ribbons. She had been engaged once to a man who had expected domestic ease and public adoration, and when that engagement dissolved, Zaniah's gaze found new targets. There were moments when the arrangement showed its practical teeth. A conversation with Zantha's adoptive mother could feel like a negotiation with a corporation. List grievances, issue ultimatums, measure benefits. They spoke often of legacy and social capital. Zantha learned, with a kind of exhausted clarity, that the marriage was less about two people and more about seating charts and who would get which column in the morning papers. He was good in public crisis. When a minor scandal, an editor's insinuation about her past, threatened to make things messy for the firms associated with the Yales and the Sharps, he made one call and the insinuation evaporated. He did not storm reporters or issue statements that sounded like threats. He used his influence in methodical, bureaucratic channels. Zantha noticed both the scope and the restraint. He did not make scenes. He made things disappear. That was his way of saying he had noticed. Between the palimpsest of work and the delicate architecture of a marriage that lived on calendars, something else moved under the surface. A ring. Jewelry, it turned out, carried more meaning than sheets in the laundry room. The ring at the center of the controversy was not the official one, but the wrong one pulled from the wrong box at the wrong time. The week between engagement and the first family gala, Zantha took a morning walk to clear the fog in her head. There was a small jeweler 2 blocks from the office, an awful place for anyone who read contracts for a living, because its light made everyone feel conspicuous. She had gone to exchange a trinket from a client, something inconsequential, and found herself distracted by window displays. The alley of small things bristled with meanings. Inside, a mislabel, a tired assistant, a ring that looked like the exact shape of someone else's promise. Zantha tried it on almost absent-mindedly. The ring pinched slightly, and she thought of how promises never fit perfectly on the first try. She handed it back, and the assistant, in a moment of incompetence or malice she could not later prove, slid a different velvet box across the counter as the same order. Zaniah, who believed in the theater of scandal, happened to be at the shop. She smiled like poison and later presented a photograph at the gala that spread across 2 family tables like oil. The image showed the wrong box opening at the wrong hour, and the caption, delivered with the artful cruelty she favored, implied that Zantha had been keeping tokens of lovers rather than honoring a single marriage. At the gala, microphones hummed with low gossip and cut crystal caught the lights. The Sharps were present in stately chaperones. The Yales played their part of the chorus. Zantha sat like a portrait with a private smile she owed her own self-defense. The photograph was passed to Crispen with no announcement, folded into the sleeve of a program like a telegram from an old hurt. He did not look up. He continued to thank patrons, to shake hands, to perform the precise gentleness expected of a man in his station. Later, in the slow, disorienting quiet of the car ride home, Zantha's throat buzzed with indignation. She expected him to say something, anything, and he said nothing. This was not cruelty. It was a choice about which battles to fight and which to absorb. He was protecting something, she realized. Not her smile, but perhaps a larger equilibrium that would be cracked if he spoke. Or perhaps he was simply the kind of man who did not indulge the dramatics of gossip. Either possibility stung in different places. She woke that night to a thermos of warm water on the bedside table. No note, no admission. She drank it because it was warm and because wounds sometimes needed heat, not explanation. Work kept arriving at her door. The trial that had been Mr. Hart's bent toward crisis, a client whose evidence had been compromised by the distraction of a rival firm. Zantha had to argue, to reframe testimony that had been scheduled and then aborted because the opposing counsel had planted a procedural trap. She prepared alone, hands cold on pages that detailed human lives reduced to precedent. The night before the hearing, she sat in the living room of the villa with a mug of cheap office coffee and a mess of notes. The house hummed with machinery and quarried silk curtains. Crispen was in his study, which was an hour's walk away if you followed the upstairs corridor. She could hear his calendar notifications even then, the muted buzz of a man whose life was measured by clocks. The next day, the firm's lead partner called her into his office and after a half-sentence of praise that tasted of obligation, handed her a folder. Inside were transcripts and a press memo carefully prepared for potential fallout. "Keep your voice steady," he said. "They'll look for an angle." In the corridor, a junior associate scuttled by and said, with the kind of whisper that aims to hurt, "I heard the Yales planted a story." Zantha breathed and turned her face into the steadying work she knew how to love. Outside court, a photographer snapped pictures of the Sharp name on the passenger seat of a car and fed them a press diet that made it seem like a coincidence. In the courtroom, Zantha learned the shape of her fight. Opposing counsel frisked for moral contradictions. A judge asked for timelines. She answered with the economy of someone who believed the law could be a moral compass if handled with care. Her stomach tightened under pressure, a real-world tremor she managed with sips of water and a small, flat breathing exercise. Crispen watched the newsfeed that afternoon in the villa as if he were monitoring a subsidiary. He messaged once, "You handle this." He did not say how. He did not say be careful. His words were as exact as a directive. His attendance at the hearing was not announced, but he stood at the back of the gallery like an unspoken presence, an axis the room revolved around without permission. The weeks collected into a ledger of small defenses and sharper accusations. Zanaya's campaigns mutated, insinuations about bloodlines, about switched births. A rumor that a child was not a blood Wayne when the family line mattered enough to knot a marriage into place. Zantha's adoptive parents, already brittle from worry, oscillated between defensiveness and shame. Their arguments sounded like negotiations for air. Bryant, her brother by blood, the one whose existence had been kept secret for a long part of her life, sent messages that were more thinly veiled than apologies. He had his own reasons for staying away, reasons she knew only in flashes. Threats from the past, men who did not let mistakes be forgiven. His return, when it finally happened, would be a title shift. For now, he was a line of text that suggested rescue without delivering it. There were small mercies. One morning after a public humiliation engineered by a jealous relative, Zantha came home to find the kitchen lit and a single bowl of porridge waiting on the counter. It was the sort of care Crispen reserved for things he could control. Warmth measured in a bowl at the right temperature, a spoon placed precisely to the right. He did not hover. He did not stage a proclamation. He set the bowl down with the economy of a man who buys safety in small investments. When she asked who had prepared it, the housekeeper nodded and said, "Only," Mr. Sharp instructed. Zantha ate. The porridge tasted like steadiness. Not all his efforts translated into comfort. There were times when his silence compounded her isolation. When Hollis Stone, an old friend who remembered a different Zantha, one from before the whispers and the negotiations, came back to town and made the mistake of calling at the wrong hour, the rumor mill spun a new thread about old loyalties and lingering feelings. Hollis's devotion had been youthful and uncomplicated, the kind of affection that made the world containable because it had no stakes. Zanaya turned it into a weapon. A photograph at the wrong cafe, a format message forwarded with a mocking annotation. The social press feasted on the human misstep and left the bones. Zantha measured these incursions with a discipline she used in court. Collect data, disprove falsehoods, maintain composure. But composure does not prevent humiliation from cutting like cold metal. At a family dinner where the Sharp board and the Yale elders sat under crystal chandeliers, Zaniah made a remark so pointed that the room fell. "Some people think blood makes them immune," she said, smiling with the practiced charity of someone who enjoyed salt in the wound. Crispen's hands tightened on the program he had been holding. He did not lift his voice. He did not admonish. Instead, he excused himself and left the table, steady as if leaving for a meeting. Later, in the quiet of the car, he placed his hand over hers with an almost bureaucratic gentleness and said, "They will not do this again." He did not storm the table or demand apologies. He made arrangements. He called the right person the next morning and dismantled a meeting scheduled that would have humiliated Zantha in front of investors. When she learned what he had done, she felt gratitude tangled with the strange ache of being protected by a man who would not make noise about his protection. It was not a declaration of feelings so much as a ledger of actions that, when read together, suggested concern. As weeks passed, an odd domestic rhythm settled into the villa. Crispen's attempts at tenderness were small and precise. A scarf placed silently over her shoulders when she stepped from the car into a storm. A delivery of chamomile tea to her office with a note that read quiet. He learned the name of the brand she preferred for unscented soap. The housekeeper, embarrassed by being the vessel of his care, mentioned these things to Zantha in the manner of someone bearing witness to a curious fact. Zantha sometimes rolled her eyes and sometimes thought about how little criminals gained from confessions. These gestures were not poetic, they were utilities of affection, like a fuse in a building that made sure certain rooms never went dark. Yet the marriage remained an arrangement, and arrangements have a way of creating cliffs. There were conversations about money, quiet ones held in boardrooms and kitchens, about what assets each family would hold in name and what legacy was at stake. The Moon Mansion, a family property of mythic value, came up again and again. The idea of home loomed large in all their arguments. Whose name would it bear? Which family diplomas would be hung on its walls? Who would claim morning sunlight at the windows facing the river? Zantha had an opinion. She wanted a place that belonged to both without having to surrender herself in the giving. Crispen believed in structures. Negotiations about titles and trust funds happened with legal counsel in rooms that smelled of coffee and clipped papers. They were not battles in which she could be sentimental. Her life in the law had trained her to see the forms of things, not the myths. And yet, even in the hum of legal forms, the human element leaked through. A veil of secrecy, a thermos on a bedside table, a scarf folded in a drawer. These small actions began to form a language between them. She could not read it fluently yet, but she learnt its alphabet: steadiness, discretion, service. It did not sweep her off her feet. It made the floor beneath her true. There was a moment, not theatrical but dense with significance, when she realized it might be possible to breathe without counting breaths. She was running late for a court filing and had left her notes at home in a scatter of exhaustion. Her phone buzzed with Crispen's assistant. The documents had been retrieved and were waiting on her desk. No one announced it as a romantic act. No sonnet accompanied the courier. But when she slid into her chair and saw the folder with a small post-it that read "Finished," she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with soup dumplings and everything to do with being accounted for. That evenings the house hummed with a different kind of silence, one that is companionable because two people have agreed, in their actions, to protect a brittle thing. Zantha, alone in the kitchen with a bowl of rice she could stomach, felt the weight of the arrangement as both armor and cell. She laughed, an unobtrusive, private sound at the contradiction. She could be adored by correctness and still be starved for touch. She could be defended with legal moves and still ache for a sentence that named her fully. Not all gestures landed their intended meaning. There were times when his cold choices felt like punishment rather than protection, and she resented that distinction. She resented being the one to interpret his silence for the family. She resented the way her own past, those old whispers about where she came from, kept intruding as an accusation rather than a story. Zanaya's campaign tightened around these resentments like a band. She orchestrated small scandals with a finesse that made life feel like court case after court case. Accusations primed, witnesses planted, and the fallout predictable. Zantha did not have illusions about redemption coming quickly. She had seen too many legal battles drawn out across years to believe in swift resolutions. What surprised her was the way a man who kept his emotions in neat envelopes began to leave them around the house in the most domestic of forms. A scarf on the banister, a cup of coffee waiting on the foyer table, an umbrella leaning by the door when rain was forecast and she had forgotten to bring one. These were not declarations. They were the kind of small cumulative evidence that builds reputations of care. She began keeping a private list in the margins of a notebook, not for evidence but to anchor herself. The night he bought a dumpling in the rain, the thermos on the bedside table, the scarf left over a study chair. The list felt absurdly bureaucratic, like someone compiling witness statements for a future historian, but it steadied her as much as any ritual. Love, she had learned in her years of observation, often arrived in installments. The first real rupture came in the guise of a gala invitation. The Sharps were hosting donors. The Yales would attend with their usual fanfare. It was to be the night when old alliances were reiterated and new ones signed. Zanaya prepared for the event with the care of a soldier polishing a sword. She was determined to ensure that the photograph at the jeweler's counter would be the headline that night, an offense made into a spectacle. On the night of the gala, Zantha stood by the window of the villa, her gown feeling like armor of a different kind, fabric meant for appearances, not comfort. Crispen watched her from behind, perfectly still. He did not make speeches. He did not call attention to kindnesses. He put on a tie that had the same mechanical precision he used in negotiations. There was an unspoken economy between them. He supplied presence, she supplied poise. Together they entered the room where the families watched them like a pair of puppets they were not sure they owned anymore. Halfway through, a photograph circulated, an image of the wrong ring in the wrong hand, and the murmur began. It was elegance turned to rumor, heads turned, conversations folded, like paper under a blade. Zantha felt the room tilt. She imagined him stepping forward then, the man who could stop a rumor with the single authority of his name, and for an instant, hope flared because she needed him to stop it. He did not move. He kept the line of his composure, letting the rumor float like a paper boat that might find its shore. That night, back in the car, under the quiet drum of rain, Zantha looked at him. He did not offer the explanation she had wanted. He folded his hands in his lap with the same motion he made when he signed papers. "They'll regret it," he said, and the words sounded like a contract clause, certain, performative, and utterly lacking in tenderness. She wanted him to say more, to say that the photograph did not mean what they insinuated, to call the room to order, and to name her for the whole person she was. Instead, he offered assurance in the only language he was comfortable with: decisive action. The following morning there were moves, a quiet reallocation of a donor meeting, a discreet phone call that shifted a journalist's schedule, a lawyer's email that shut down a gossip column before it could take breath. Each act was small, deliberate. Each one protected her name without exposing his feelings. Zantha, who was accustomed to speaking and protecting herself in court, felt both grateful and exasperated at this strange tenderness that preferred utility over eloquence. Even so, the photograph had been a public thing, and public things settled into reputations. In the days that followed, whispers found new quarters. There were pressures from the board, social invitations rescinded, and the guile of a social season that hung like heavy curtains. The center of gravity in Zantha's life moved, begrudgingly, toward a question she had not wanted to face. What would it take for an arrangement to become something closer to a choice? It was a question she could not answer in legal pleadings. It required a vocabulary she had not practiced, private acknowledgments, the willingness to say small things that felt impossibly large, the surrender of a defense that had hitherto been her strength. Crispen, for his part, continued to act in ways that meant what they did without saying why. His love, if it could be called that yet, presented itself as fidelity in the administrative sense, protection, consistency, and decisions made on her behalf. Zantha walked into the firm the day Mr. Hart's case moved from delicate to urgent, and felt the world press close around her. A new affidavit had surfaced, and with it, a legal strategy that would expose old family entanglements if pursued. She handled it the way she always did, calmly with strategy, and yet the stakes had been recalibrated by the social pressure the photograph had put into motion. Her client's case had become a prism through which everyone could view the tangled history of the Waynes and Yales. She could lose a case or win one and watch the losses shape the lives around her. When Bryant's voice finally cut through the static, his plane landing announced like a low drumbeat, there was a tangible shift in the home. He walked into the foyer of the villa like someone arriving with currency, the kind of presence that could transfer not only legal ownership, but the narrative of a family. He was taller than she remembered, hands roughened by whatever battles had kept him away, and he carried a calm that felt like the kind of power you only see in men who have had to wait a long time to make a move. His arrival was not a fix. It was a turn in the compass. For the first time since the arrangement had been made, there was another person in the room whose decisions mattered as much as the Sharp name. They talked late that night, in a room that smelled like wood polish and old money. He spoke of transfers that could shore up her legal position without theatricality, of moving papers in ways that would separate her name from petty slanders. He had a plan that would be slow and careful. He would not, he promised, sweep in and make a show. But his presence recalibrated the family ledger, and she felt the weight of it settle differently. By the time the month had turned, the villa had the look of a place where treaties were honored and cold coffee found in thermoses could mean more than it seemed. Crispen continued to be exact. Zantha continued to be competent. Zaniah continued to sharpen rumors into weapons. Mr. Hart lay convalescing with slurred sentences, and a trial loomed like a cliff face. The ring that had been opened at the jeweler, and displayed like proof of some infidelity, remained a spur in the side of the family's reputation. And above all, the arrangement continued to teach them both the strange arithmetic of marriage, the sums of small acts adding up into something that might yet be called a promise. There would be confrontations to come, a boardroom fight where loyalty would be counted in shares, a family settlement where names would be assigned to front pages, and a decision she would have to make about whether commitment required a signature or something more private and brutal. Choice. For now, the only certainty was that things were tightening their threads. The city outside the villa continued to turn, indifferent, and Crispen, cold, precise, unexpectedly careful, watched the way she balanced the world and began, perhaps without meaning to measure his life in moments that had nothing to do with his empire. If you love slow burn CEO romance and want more of this unfolding, like and subscribe. There are more pages to turn in Zantha's story. A week later, a new crisis announced itself with the bluntness of a siren. An old ledger from the Yale estate had been found, menial paper with the dangerous potential to rewrite claims. It wasn't just legal, it was a public invitation for old enemies to reawaken. Zantha opened the file with her practiced calm. Inside were numbers and names that tangled the narrative of her family in ways she could not yet parse. Someone had left a note in the margin in an unfamiliar hand. Make them choose. At the next family meeting, voices rose in a way they had not since the wedding papers were signed. Zaniah moved like a conductor of discord, her fingers perfect on the strings she wanted broken. "We should litigate," she said, each syllable sharpened. "We should assert what is ours." The room divided into camps with the stubby efficiency of an assembly line. Bryant watched everyone like a man who had a place to put the weights. Crispen leaned back in his chair, hands folded, the image of a man used to letting other people's trades be his weather. In Zantha's pocket, her phone buzzed with a message. "Come to the office." It was Crispen. No time for explanation, just a place and a time. She stood, the way one rises when a judge gives a court order. The villa felt suddenly too large and too small all at once. In the car she measured the silence between them. He did not speak until they reached his car park, and when he did, his voice was the same precise instrument she had come to rely on. "You handle the legal," he said. "I'll handle the rest." What does the rest mean, she thought. Protection? Yes. Power? Yes. A vow of something beyond the edges of a contract, perhaps? Or merely the social leverage of a name that could make papers fold into submission? She could not know yet. She only knew that in a life measured in briefs and footnotes, a man who did small exacting kindnesses had begun to map a territory around her that felt like a slow, cautious claim. She walked into her office with the file under her arm and felt the room change the way an audience leans in. Mr. Hart's papers waited in a neat pile. Her name was being whispered in the channels that mattered. The Ring episode was past the sparkle of novelty and into the stubborn phase where people made assumptions and wrote them on online forums. She sat at her desk and opened the ledger discovered by the Yale's accountants. The number of stakeholders, the possible interpretations, the way public trust could be eroded if old documents were mishandled, all of it rolled into a fierce, lucid responsibility. She was tired. She was also impossible to intimidate. Her stomach flooded with fatigue, but she steadied herself with the work she knew how to do. Cut the ambiguity, find the facts, build the argument. Outside, the city made its ceaseless noise. Inside, she scheduled meetings and calls and a strategy session with Bryant. He had arrived not to fix things with showmanship. He had arrived with boxes of documents and a calm that suggested he had been sharpening maps while the family bickered. That night, after a day that had compressed into a series of small victories and small humiliations, Zantha returned home to find another small thing had appeared on the kitchen counter. A pair of cheap paper cups from a street vendor, lids pressed down, steam curling like a promise. On one lid someone had written in a tidy hand, "For the late night." On the other, "For the brave one." Crispen's handwriting was not exact. It was deliberate. She sat at the kitchen counter and held the cup in both hands like a talisman. The steam fogged her glasses. There was no speech, no grand admission. But in the air between them, there was a softness that had not been manufactured by speeches or press releases. It was the gentle accumulation of habit, the way small things gather meaning like dust on a windowsill. Outside, the phone in the family room buzzed. A message from a journalist, blunt and hungry. "Will you comment on the ledger?" Within the next day, choices would need to be made. Public statements, legal maneuvers, decisions about which battle to fight and which to let slide. Zantha read the message, felt the familiar legal hunger, and looked across the kitchen to find him watching her. He did not look pleased. He did not look tender. He looked like a man who had decided to be necessary. "What do you want to do?" he asked, not as a man who owned the answer, but as someone willing to be involved in the painstaking work of making things right. She tasted the phrase before she answered. The words were not law. They were not business. They were something in between. "We fight smart," she said. "We do not feed the rumor machine. We use facts." She felt the steadiness return as if it were a muscle engaged. "We protect what cannot be easily fixed." He nodded. The nod was slight, almost imperceptible. In that motion she felt something like a concession, that he would, in his careful way, volunteer to be a part of the messy work that made a marriage more than signatures. They made plans. Bryant would request a review of the ledger in private. The firm would prepare statements preemptively. Crispen arranged to meet investors on terms that would contain gossip. It was practical. It was unromantic. It suited them both. But as she lay in bed that night, the thermos of warm water cooling on the nightstand, Zantha thought of the list in her notebook and added, almost in penance, a new item. "The man who will move quietly to save you." Outside, rain began again, tapping the windows like a clock. Inside, a scarf lay across a chair where he had left it last week. She closed her eyes and pressed her hand to the place on the fabric where his scent stamped it, as if to make the moment more than a contract clause. The fact of his care, so small, so coded, so precise, had started to lengthen into something that might one day be called fidelity. The ledger would mean hearings, the photograph would mean reputations tested. Zaniah would not relent, Bryant would not be enough. But for the first time since he had slid the pen across the table, Zantha felt, in the way a lawyer feels the outline of a case, that there was a pattern forming, an accumulation of small acts that might, over time, amount to something profound. She did not yet know whether she would choose to stay for love or for safety. She only knew that he had gone from an inert steel to a machinery that moved on her behalf, and that in the arithmetic of their life, even a small, precise gesture could tip the balance. The next morning's headlines would arrive with the same impartial cruelty as any judge. The choice would not be made for her. But the thermos on the nightstand and the scarf on the chair were a language she was learning, and the learning felt like it might take a very long time. The phone buzzed again. Another message. From Zaniah. The message from Zanaya sat on the screen like a black smile, a photograph attached, captioned with a line that smelled of triumph. Zantha stared at it until the pixels blurred into a pattern she could almost catalog. She had learned to turn rumors into arguments, and arguments into outcomes. She knew how to take the cruel things people hurled and fold them into the evidence she could present. But a photograph was different. A photograph could be a fact in the court of public opinion, and sometimes facts, no matter how manufactured, carved truth out of lives. She set the phone face down and went to the window. Rain had begun again, the city wet and restless like a thing reconsidering itself. The villa felt suddenly too full of other people's expectations. Crispen was in the study. She could hear the distant hum of a monitor, the soft mechanical tapping of someone who measured minutes in agendas. The house's silence was a heavy thing this evening. She could not tell whether the heaviness belonged to her or to him. She called Bryant. He picked up on the second ring, his voice the same quiet anchor it had been the night he arrived. "I saw it," he said without preface. There was no anger in it, only calculation. "Stay put, let me come by." When Bryant arrived, his presence steadied the room the way a well-placed brace steadies a sagging wall. He moved through the villa with an objectivity Zantha had come to respect. He did not flinch at family messes, he catalogued them. "This is manufactured," he said after one look at the photograph. "We can show timestamp inconsistencies, chain of custody, the shop's logs. There are ways to prove it was staged." She listened, appreciative of the legal choreography he proposed. It all sounded sensible, an armory of facts, but she could feel the edges of something else, the exhaustion of being under siege. "It's not just facts," Zantha said. "It's the hum. The way people will talk even when we prove it wrong. They'll write the story first and correct it later. The headline sticks." He reached for her hand across the kitchen island as if the physicality of it could transmit steadiness. "Then we change the story's center," Bryant said. "We don't let the photograph define the narrative. We redirect the conversation, legally and socially, and I'll be on it. You won't be alone." Alone had become a yardstick Zantha used to measure the shape of her life. She felt gratitude for Bryant's presence. She also felt an unnameable exhaustion at having to defend herself in a world that preferred spectacle to nuance. She thought of the list in her notebook, the dumpling, the thermos, the scarf, and how absurd it felt to keep tally like a clerk of intimacy. Yet those small things were now the only units she trusted to measure the man who had married her under pressure and then somehow, through tiny, considerate acts, had begun to unmake the transaction's sterility. In the days that followed, the house operated like a command center. Bryant's calm spread into the rooms. He coordinated a private meeting with the jewelry shop, found surveillance footage that introduced inconvenient questions into Zanaya's neat narrative, and quietly engaged counsel who specialized in reputational matters. Zantha continued to do what she had always done, apply logic to the messy. She reconstructed timelines, cross-referenced receipts, and drafted statements that would say enough without amplifying the rumor. The public machinery, however, did what public machinery does. A tabloid piece ran with the photograph and an uncouth headline designed for mouths that like to chew gossip. The Sharp board grew restless. Investors who had once praised stability now whispered about distraction. A shareholder called for a briefing. In private, board members expressed concern that the Sharp name's association with scandal, even if manufactured, could erode confidence. Crispen handled each tremor in his own nervous system of control. To everyone who watched, he remained composed. He tightened the screws behind the scenes. He asked his legal team for contingency plans, directed communication strategy with the same precision he used in quarterly reviews, and told Zantha, in the clipped language they had grown accustomed to, that he would not tolerate a campaign against her. His words were small, measured, and efficient. "I will see this contained." When the board demanded a public statement, his response disadvantaged none of them. He refused to give the tabloids power by repeating their lies. Instead, he offered, in an impassive forum designed for investors, a brief and airtight affirmation of the company's values and a note that personal matters of employees and family connected to executives should not be fodder for speculation. To some it was the action of a man protecting a brand. To Zantha, who watched the stream of the statement, it felt like a careful placement of a shield. He had not shouted her innocence in a salon of lights, he had bolstered her position where it mattered. But there were other currents at work. Zaniah did not stop at photographs. She cultivated narratives with the single-mindedness of a strategist with too much vendetta and too little conscience. She introduced whispers about financial impropriety in the Yale Trust and hinted, ever so delicately, that Zantha's role in the marriage might be a conduit for outside influence. A reputational sinkhole formed. Friends who had been neutral turned cautious. Invitations thinned. Criticism spooled on social platforms, a slow-release poison. Zantha began to sense the isolating design of the campaign. Those who had no stake now had the luxury of being moral judges. Hollis Stone, who had once tried to be a kindness to Zantha in a messy world, called with earnest simplicity and the wrong timing. He wanted to meet, to talk, to remember. Zantha, who had not lied about the life she had once not chosen, was careful. She met him in a small cafe and thanked him for his loyalty. She told him the truth in the minimal way she always used in court. Direct, honest, and with no embellishment. Hollis's face fell slightly. He had hoped for an opening, for a rekindling of something uncomplicated. She closed the door gently. She needed allies, not complicated attachments. Then came the board meeting that would pressure the marriage in ways neither legal nor private plans had predicted. A faction of shareholders, alarmed by the cadenced drip of rumor, publicly questioned whether the company could maintain its course while its executive family was tied into scandal. Some wanted a temporary separation of Crispen from his marital obligations, symbolic and procedural. It was the sort of suggested measure that had been rehearsed in the margins of financial discourse, and it carried the undertone that personal ties were liabilities. Crispen entered the room like a man who always understood the stakes of appearance. He listened to the insinuations with the thin lid of his attention closing, and then, when silence allowed, he spoke. He did not wax poetic. He did not weaponize charm. He stated, in unadorned sentences, that the company would not base its decisions on the torrent of rumors that preyed on personal lives, that the firm's posture was to support employees and associated family members harmed by coordinated attacks, and that any move to distance or demote would be evaluated on performance and not on gossip. He signaled, with bureaucratic certainty, that he was prepared to anchor the company against the tide. There was applause, politely measured, mid-century corporate, but there was also a quieter consequence. By publicly framing his support as one of governance and fairness, he shielded Zantha differently than a lover on a stage might. He offered her protection not as sentiment, but as structure. He used the language of his empire to fix what had threatened to unmoor her. The reprieve was temporary. Zaniah pivoted to a new weapon. She gave an interview to a minor investigative blog and, with practiced cruelty, suggested that the marriage had been a transaction that had never needed affection. She predicted a separation. She hinted that Zantha was already discussing terms of a divorce with certain advisors. The narrative was built to resemble prophecy. It caught like dry leaves in a stairwell. Zantha read the article with her legal face on, catalogued the assertion, prepared the rebuttal. She called the firm. She called Bryant. She breathed and kept to the work. But when the whispers moved from the pages to the villa's kitchen table, when someone from the sharp inner circle started asking, in the clinical way of people who feared contagion, whether the marriage would last, she felt something else stir. Doubt. There is an exhaustion that comes not from labor, but from having to defend your capacity to be loved. It is an ache Zantha felt late at night, an abrasion behind the sternum that no porridge could soothe. She began to imagine leaving not because she wanted freedom, but because she wanted respite. The idea of separating, to take her life away from the calendared warmth of the villa, back to a small apartment where food was predictable and the world had only the legal noise she could manage, became a private outline of relief. She held this thought with the same impartiality she held a case file. Note it, weigh it, test for feasibility. It did not take long for people to notice the new line in the villa's calendar. She moved into an upstairs study on a different evening, kept her nights more to herself. Crispen noticed and made no comment. That silence, like many before it, could have been a wound or an offering. She could not tell. It made her consider the possibility that protection measured in distance could feel like abandonment. The next rupture came with a whisper of legal motion. A request from a solicitor with Zaniah's backing to review the marriage settlement. The message was formal, predictably careful. There would be meetings, there would be negotiations. There was the quiet beginning of a process that could become a wedge. Zantha, who had always believed in agency, did what she always did, prepared. She began to draft for contingencies, to outline what she would accept and what she would not. She listed non-negotiables: her work's autonomy, the right to retain her name professionally, reasonable custody of any shared assets that meant safety, not spectacle. But even as she argued in the calculus of drafting terms, she felt the human thing, fear that an arranged marriage, begun as a transaction, might end the same way, with lines drawn and signatures exchanged like the closing of a ledger. Crispen's movements during this time were instructive. He did not attend every meeting. He did not issue a circular of avowal. He acted in the subtle ways he had formed into habit. He shifted the company calendar to postpone a donor gala that would have been an occasion for Zinaya's triumph. He quietly ensured that investor conversations would not erode Zantha's professional opportunities. He redirected a set of legal inquiries into channels that would give her time and privacy. These were not grand gestures, they were immunizations. They kept infection from taking hold. But what Crispen did not do, what he had rarely done, was speak plainly to Zantha about what he wanted. His silence was not a refusal of feeling so much as an economy of speech. Words that he feared would be used against them if aired. The space this created had margins. It let in worry. He was unwilling to make an easily quotable declaration. She was unwilling to let her life be shaped by indirect acts alone. Late one evening, as the house was settling into its nocturnal machinery, Zantha found a folder on the kitchen table. There was no note. Inside were documents detailing a proposal, a trust arrangement Bryant had prepared at Crispen's request, designed to place the Moon Mansion and certain family assets into a jointly managed structure under Zantha and Bryant's stewardship. The language was careful and deliberately non-litigious. It would protect her from certain claims and untangle some of the perceived conflicts of interest the tabloids had pounced on. There were clauses labeled indefinido, places where legal counsel still needed to define specifics, but the intention was unambiguous, a material act of protection. Her first reaction was bewilderment, then gratitude, then a fresh current of worry. If the trust reallocated assets, would it be perceived as a sign of weakness or as a display of power? Would this placate some and inflame others? She realized the offering was both practical and intimate. It said, without a single syllable of sentiment, that someone had taken decisive action on her behalf. She called Crispen's assistant and, through him, arranged to meet Crispen in the study. She found him at his desk, the light of his monitor painting his cheekbones in a pallid glow. He looked at her without surprise, as if this conversation was merely another item to be transacted. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No," he replied. "It's not a discussion, it's a measure." She sat opposite him and tried to measure the degree of vulnerable tenderness in his expression. It was a subtle thing, a loosened jaw, a momentary lapse in the steel. "Why?" she asked. "Because you asked me to protect you," he said simply. "Because defending you is the most efficient use of my leverage, because I decided I would not stand by and watch you be dismantled by people who manufacture evidence." The answer was not a poem. It was a justification wrapped in duty, but it was also an admission of priority. He had chosen to invest his power in making a practical barrier against the world that cornered her. The admission landed like a small stabilizing hand, yet the gesture came with a price. It made the arrangement's transactional origin more visible. People could interpret the trust as evidence that Zantha was dependent on the Sharp name to secure the assets she needed. That interpretation would come. The question, private and raw, remained. Would she accept this as protection, or would she resent it as another clause in a contract she had never wanted? Before she could answer fully, a more public crisis erupted. The firm she represented faced a hearing where the opposing counsel, sharp and politically minded, introduced a witness whose testimony subtly suggested the marriage had been a factory for influence. They quizzed Zantha, insinuated motives, and threaded the public rumor into the supposed fabric of the case. The courtroom became a place where reputation and legal standing could intertwine dangerously. Zantha performed the work she knew. She dismantled the assumptions, exposed the gaps in the witness's memory, and reframed the case with the clinical efficiency of someone who had never allowed sentiment to interfere with strategy. It was her element. She was luminous in it. The judge listened. The testimony collapsed like a poorly built bridge. Her client's case held. The victory was professional and clean. But outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Headlines the next morning characterized the hearing as a spectacle where her marriage and her competence had both been interrogated. A commentator wondered aloud whether the arranged nature of her marriage might be a structural conflict of interest. The question, posed in the dull, neutral tone of media, felt like an accusation. It was after that morning of headlines, after the trial had ended and the legal work had been done, that she came home to an empty living room and a note on the coffee table. It read, in Crispen's precise hand, "Meet me at the Moon Mansion." No explanation. The message was a summons. The Moon Mansion had always been more symbol than home. It had been a place where lineage was rehearsed and displays of status were performed. To be invited there, under the circumstances, was to be invited into the room where the families negotiated their public images. Zantha dressed simply and drove alone. The city's skyline passed in measured stages. When she arrived, she found Crispen waiting in a study that smelled faintly of old books and tobacco. His attempt, in private, to soften industrial lines with domestic age, he gestured for her to sit. The house had an aura that felt like a display case for history. "They are asking me to distance myself," he said without preface. "They think a separation will contain the gossip." "And you?" she asked. He looked at her with the blank, concentrated face she had learned to read. "I thought a separation might make you easier to protect," he said. "I researched what that would mean. I asked questions, but I cannot do it." She surprised herself by asking the question directly, the one she had held like a stone in her purse. "Why not?" He put both hands on the desk, palms down, as if to keep himself still. "Because when they ask me to distance myself, they ask me to do the thing that would make your vulnerability easier to exploit. They ask me to let you be alone so they can test the seams. I will not provide someone with that hole." His voice held no flourish. It held instead an immovable logic. His refusal was not dramatic. It did not bloom into heartfelt confession. It was a refusal informed by protection and by the kind of loyalty Crispen understood. Defense on principle. He explained the stakes, the legal implications in measured phrases, and the actions he had taken, calling off certain meetings, moving assets into the trust, instructing public relations to maintain a posture of dignity. Each action was a counterweight to Zanaya's campaign. She listened, and for the first time in weeks, felt the ice on the arrangement shifting from brittle to flexible. The shape of his care was not the expression she had been trained to expect in romance. It was a calculus. Identify harm, neutralize harm. But shelter can be love, she told herself, if its sheltering is chosen rather than required. Still, words without tenderness left her wanting. She pressed the point. "You will not say anything, ever?" she asked. "That I can use?" Crispen considered. The corners of his mouth loosened imperceptibly, an event she learned to cherish. "When words are useful, I will use them," he said. "But they are not my first tools. Actions are. I will not make a speech that exposes the two of us to more harm. I will take the actions that make harm impossible." She understood. The answer was both a promise and a boundary. They left the Moon Mansion with the unspoken agreement that they would continue to choose protection, even if their choices were not visible to those who wanted spectacle. Then, the blow that seemed like it would break whatever fragile progress existed came from within the villa itself. A private conversation, an overheard remark, a gossip-laced text forwarded by an embarrassed housekeeper, became the seed of a new rumor. That Crispen had been unfaithful years before, that he used distance as a cover, and that Zantha was a last-minute appendage in a life already occupied. The calculation was cruel. If Zantha could not stake a claim to intimacy, then the arrangement would always be a negotiation. It was the low she had feared. She retreated into the legal work, into late hours and thin coffee. She accepted invitations the way a professional accepted tasks she did not love, because they were necessary. Crispen, who watched the axis of her energy tilt inward, withdrew further into his work. The villa's rooms grew compartmentalized, not by physical walls, but by the emotional distances they signified. Separated nights, separate routines, communiques that felt like memos. The arrangement had become, in form, what it had been in letter. She found herself asking, in quiet moments, whether the accumulation of good deeds could substitute for the intimate language she wanted. Could a thermos of broth ever speak the words that mattered? Could a trust be equivalent to a vow? Bryant, sensing the drift, called a family meeting. He insisted on clarity and on a ceremony, something small and unpublicized, that would signify a commitment of sorts. He framed it not as a romance, but as a contract of mutual care, signed by people who would do harm if they wanted to. His proposal was practical and almost legalistic, a private reaffirmation with witnesses that would be enforceable in a way the tabloids could not easily breach. It was the kind of move Zantha both appreciated and feared. She agreed to the meeting as a test of whether the marriage could be recast into a chosen thing. The number of witnesses was small. Bryant, a trusted legal advisor, the housekeeper who had seen the charities of the small acts, and one family friend who owed no loyalty to gossip. Crispen arrived with a folder. He did not carry a speech. He brought instead a ring. It was not the flash of the jeweler's wrong box. It was a new ring. Quiet, unshowy, the kind of band you noticed for its careful fit rather than its sparkle. He placed it on the table between them like a deliberate insertion. "I could have used other measures," he said cleanly, "but there is a simplicity here." Xantha's first reaction was to catalogue the metal, the weight, the scale against her fingers. Then a flaring of something she had kept meticulous notes on. The man before her had over and over translated his care into domestic utilities. The ring was not his first language, it was a concession to hers. They signed the small documents Bryant had prepared. Language about mutual care, about the agreed trust, about joint stewardship of certain assets. Language that read like law but felt like covenant. There were no cameras, no reporters, no dramatics. The housekeeper sat with her hands folded, steady as a minor saint. When the paper was signed, Crispen reached out and with an odd economy of movement took Xantha's hand. It was not theatrical, it was an offer. Later, after the documents had been filed away in a safe and the guests had left, the villa felt buoyed by a private gravity. The papers were not an antidote to everything, but they were a social structure, a scaffolding they had chosen to erect together. Zantha slept that night without counting breaths, but storm clouds did not dissipate immediately. Zaniah, furious that her wedge had been neutralized by the trust and the secret reaffirmation, sought another path. She approached Jasper Locke, a man with an old entanglement in their orbit. Jasper had once been engaged to Zaniah. He had left, some said for freedom, others whispered of cowardice. Zaniah, in her desire for leverage, offered him access to scandal for a price, a public statement about a supposed impropriety in Crispen's past. Jasper, whose life had been a series of compromises, calculated the gain. He staged a conversation in an upscale bar where a journalist with a taste for transactional scoops waited. He spoke in half-truths, suggested improprieties, and left a trail meant to suggest moral ambiguity. It was neither sophisticated nor subtle, but the danger lay in its breathability. Once a man of that name whispered a rumor, it was easier for others to pick the thread. The effect was immediate. A boutique news site ran a piece that implied Crispen's prior relationships had involved conflicts of interest. The item was coy, full of insinuation, and formatted to create speculation. The Sharp board summoned Crispen for a meeting, and some members asked, for the sake of optics, whether a public distancing might now be strategic. Crispen returned from the meeting with a paper in his hand and a look Zantha had seldom seen. A face that had decided on a course of action and would not be turned. Instead of agreeing to distance, he made a decision that unsettled the polished boardroom politics. He prepared a public statement, not a love letter, but a succinct articulation of principle. He announced that any board member who sought to capitalize on rumor over substance would be voting to undermine the company's principles. He said plainly that the company would not permit private gossip to determine corporate policy. The move cost him some applause in the room. It also cost him votes, but it forced a recalibration. He publicly embraced a posture of fairness that made the idea of punishing Zantha for manufactured slanders seem barbaric. He chose, in a corporate forum, to take the hit rather than acquiesce to fear. To him, the marriage was not an asset to be traded. It was a human life that deserved defense. For Zantha, the gesture was a public proof, not a promise of poetry, but a choice in the open. The effect on her was not immediate euphoria, it was a long, softening recognition. She began to track, in her notebook, the instances where his actions made a difference. The trust, the postponed gala, the calls to journalists, the public statement. The list read less like a tally and more like a ledger of fidelity. Yet within the private calculus of their life, there remained one more test. Zinaya's campaign shifted yet again, now toward a legalistic strike. She suggested that the marriage contract itself might be contested for undue influence, and her counsel filed motions. The motion's language was dry, its purpose was not. It was designed to force discovery, to open documents, to drag private acts into public rooms. Zantha felt the old loneliness return. The plan had been to wear her down with attention. She considered conceding. The idea of stepping away from the villa and the calendar to preserve her peace looked luminous in the imagination, an escape hatch from the pressure. But she also saw the consequences. Stepping away could make the slander feel true to observers. It could let the narrative of transaction turned sour take hold. She sat with the gravity of choice. If she walked away, would she be leaving of her own volition, or because she had been cornered into acquiescence? The night before the hearing that would determine whether the motions would proceed, she found a handwriting on the kitchen counter. A small card with his initials printed, and beneath it a line in his blunt script. "Come to the square at noon." She asked the housekeeper if anyone had delivered it. The housekeeper shook her head. The route of the card's delivery, like most of his care, was not elegant, it was precise. At noon the square was busy, dealers, a couple of tourists, a man juggling oranges near a fountain. Crispen was there, standing slightly aside as if the location were carefully chosen for its neutrality. He did not make a public show of affection. He met her eyes and gave a minimal gesture, 2 fingers to the corner of his mouth, something like an acknowledgement. "I will be in the hearing," he said. "Not to answer for you, but to stand where I can be counted." Her first reaction was that it was a bureaucratic presence, which it was. He would be visible in the gallery, an axis of someone unwilling to let her be tried alone. But then she noticed the people turning their heads to see him. The press would take notice, yes, but his visibility in the room meant something else. He refused to be silent in the face of orchestrated harm. The hearing was procedural and unpleasant. Zinaya's team asked for broad discovery, designed to make her hand tremble under the weight of exposure. Zantha held the court's attention with the competence she had always had. She answered questions without drama and called out the relevant legal standards. When the judge ruled to limit discovery to protect private matters unless specific evidence suggested otherwise, Zantha felt a quiet triumph. It was a practical win, procedural and not romantic, but it was one she had earned. After the hearing, in the gallery's corridor, a photographer tried to push a microphone between them. Crispen took one step toward the reporter and, in a tone both calm and final, said something that would be transcribed and excerpted in next-day pieces. "We will not let manufactured narratives become reality. I stand with the truth." The sentence was not a sonnet. It was short, direct, and public. It was the kind of thing he did rarely, and when he did, it had the force of an executive order. The effect on Zantha was startling. For the first time in months, she felt the edges of what she had wanted, a man who, in public, was willing to make a short, undeniable statement on her behalf. It was not sentimental, it was protective. It was an action that, when combined with the trust, the careful legal moves, and the small acts at home, began to form a pattern that could be read as something more than duty. There remained, however, the most intimate test, whether their partnership would cease to be an arrangement and instead become a choice made out loud. They did not solve this in a boardroom or with papers. They solved it in the small domestic language that had become their dialect of care. One evening, after a week of exhausting hearings and quiet victories, Zantha returned to the villa to find the sitting room arranged differently. The curtains were drawn back. The fireplace had been lit despite the mild weather. A small table sat between two armchairs with 2 cups of chamomile and, set beside one of them, a small battered copy of a book she liked that neither of them ever read in full. The housekeeper, embarrassed like someone sharing a secret, told her nothing had been staged by her. The arrangement was personal. Crispen entered quietly and stood across from her. He looked at her for longer than business required. "You handled the hearing well," he said. His voice had the faintest trace of something she had rarely heard, approval that was not merely strategic. "Thank you," she replied. The 2 words felt like a bridge. He reached for the ring he had placed on the documents months earlier, the small band he had produced at the private reaffirmation, and slid it onto her finger. There was no public performance, no flourish, just a small deliberate placement. "I didn't do speeches," he said. "I do things. Those things are for you." She thought absurdly of the ledger she kept in a notebook. Dumplings, thermoses, scarves, trust documents, public statements. The list did not converge into a tidy pronouncement. It was a tapestry of acts. She slid her hand toward his, and with the same purposeful movement, took his in a way that felt like acceptance, not surrender. They did not promise everything in that room. They did not write the grand words novels use. Instead, they made small commitments, to speak frankly when necessary, to protect each other when danger came, to preserve Zantha's autonomy and career, and to create a home where length of care mattered more than spectacle. Crispen agreed that, where his actions would be seen as inscrutable, he would attempt, modestly, to offer a clarifying phrase now and then. Zantha agreed that she would accept protection that did not ask her to trade her agency for comfort. Outside, the world kept writing and rewriting what it wanted to be true. Zinaya was not defeated. She sulked into corners and whispered accusations that other people seeking drama amplified. Jasper moved on to other mischief. Hollis retreated gracefully. Bryant continued to work his quiet legal choreography in the background, a reliable force. Mr. Hart's recovery, slow and steadier than expected, provided a parallel to Zantha's own life. Wounded, tended, resilient. She visited him, and he, in his half-jesting, half-sincere way, said, "You are fighting the right kinds of fights." His words felt like a benediction. Months passed. The villa took on the look of a place where 2 people had decided to make a life that looked ordinary, but was anything but. There were mornings with porridge warmed just so, scarves laid out, and not as armor, but as an invitation, and a thermos that one of them would half leave for the other on nights of long work. There were arguments about schedules, negotiations about boundaries, and laughter that sounded private because it was. The ring subplot resolved itself with the clarity of small efforts. The jeweler admitted fault under the pressure of Bryant's evidence. The photograph's origin traced to a misfiled order, and public corrections were issued where necessary. The tabloids, like seasons, moved on to fresher prey. Zinaya, stripped of the dramatic edge she'd exploited, found her influences waning. She learned in time that the theater of bitterness has a short half-life. There was one final public gesture that sealed what had been forming in private. An industry function, one they could have avoided, was scheduled for the spring. Crispen was on the panel roster. He announced to the crowd and to the cameras that Zantha would be his guest. He stood up to introduce her, briefly outlining her professional achievements with a blunt pride that was almost performance. "She is a lawyer who does not bend to spectacle. She is my partner in the ways that matter." The sentence was short, precise, and publicly binding. Reporters wrote the quote into their notes. The piece that followed focused on Zantha's competence, not the gossip. For once, the public narrative matched the private truth. The final reconciliation with the families was not an ovation. It was a series of small negotiations, a dinner where Bryant sat with an elder Yale and brokered terms that protected identities without erasing bonds, an acknowledgement from Zantha's adoptive mother that she too had been bruised and wanted peace. Families do not tidy into neat houses overnight. They rearrange like furniture, slowly, always maintaining some items as memories. In the quiet after the public storms, Zantha and Crispen created a ritual that would stand for them. It involved nothing grand. A bowl of porridge, his careful placement of a scarf across her shoulders, A letter they read to one another in private and kept in a drawer for hard days. The words they used were simple: acknowledgement, appreciation, a willingness to be accountable. They read the letter aloud once a year, on the anniversary of the day their signatures had closed a chapter of their lives and, paradoxically, opened another. It was their private liturgy. On the anniversary they shared, Crispen prepared the small bowl of porridge at the morning's first light. He carried it into the bedroom, placed it on the tray, and looked at her. There was no fanfare. He sat and said, in the blunt language that had become his, "I was forced into this at first. I remain because I choose you." She looked at him, at the quiet face that had learned to register tenderness in action rather than in speech, and felt the exhaustion of years fall away like a cloak. "I was forced into this too," she replied. "But this—" She gestured at the bowl, the room, the ring on her hand. "This is what we are choosing now." He reached across, took her hand, and in that small contact there was the sense of something endless, not because it was flamboyantly grand, but because they had translated the scaffolded beginnings into a continuing practice: steady attention, mutual respect, protection that preserved agency. That, Zantha decided, was a kind of endless love. It was not a fiery blaze, but a long tending fire that warmed rather than burned. They did not pretend the world had been changed. Zaniah remained a complicated shadow in the margins, family disputes sometimes resurfaced, and the firm's calendar always promised new storms. But when hardship came, they met it as a pair who had made the daily choice to be for each other. Crispen would not often write flowery notes. Zantha would not drop all her defenses. They kept the careful balance they had negotiated. He would act decisively when danger threatened, and she would preserve her voice and her work. The Moon Mansion remained a joint symbol. No one family's trophy, no single person's claim. Bryant continued to watch and move with the slow, effective competence of someone who had spent years waiting for a moment to rectify a wrong. He did not make speeches. He made sure papers were in order, and that the trust structure protected against future attacks. On a late summer evening, the villa's kitchen smelled of the porridge they had come to favor. They sat across from one another, fingers interlaced over the small table they used for more than quick breakfasts. The house had the familiar hush of a place that had learned to balance noise and quiet. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, the banalities of everyday life, the washing, the mail, the scheduling, felt like the body of a commitment, ordinary, repetitive, dependable. Crispen reached across and tucked a scarf around Zantha's shoulders, the same small action that had been the first seed of tenderness months earlier. "I will do the things that keep you safe," he said, his voice grimmer than romantic, better suited to his nature. "And I will be the person who fights with my voice and my work," she replied. "I will not be silent just because you are loud." They laughed then, a small sound that did not pretend to be more than it was. It was contentment. It was understanding. It was the sound of two people who had been forced into a shape and then, with stubborn care, had made that shape theirs. In the years that followed, when friends recollected the oddness of their beginning, they told the story differently each time. Some emphasized the contract. Some remarked on the coldness. Others, noticing the steady gestures, decided the marriage had always been something more complicated, an arrangement that, through chosen action, had become a devotion. Zantha continued to argue cases that mattered to her. Crispen continued to steward an empire that required both force and discretion. They shared a home that bore the marks of their combined lives: mismatched mugs, a scarf on a banister, a small notebook with a list of kindnesses. That notebook, sometimes laughed at by friends, remained a talisman for Zantha, a record of how small things had grown into a promise. One evening, years after the photograph that had nearly undone them, Zantha stood in the villa's foyer and watched Crispen pick up his coat. He paused at the doorway, looked back, and used the small, deliberate language she had come to accept as his version of tenderness. "I am coming back," he said. She smiled at the precise warmth in the words. "I know," she said, "and I will be here." They had been forced into a marriage. They had, over time, made it a choice. They had secret rituals and public battles, protections and vows measured in trust documents and bowls of porridge. Love in their life had not been sudden or cinematic. It had arrived in installments, in the sturdy ledger of actions that, when read together, spelled out something enduring. If you felt the slow burn of this story and want to see more of Zantha and Crispen's life unfold, more quiet victories, private vows, and the gentle accumulation of devotion, watch the full adaptation or read the complete novel. Share which small act of care spoke to you most. Tell us whether you keep your own list of little gestures that make a relationship. Like, share, and comment. There are more pages to turn in their story.